In this clip, I will describe a cluster text. It looks like this. It has a maximum line length of 95 characters and a maximum column width of 13 centimeters. In reality, however, they are often shorter as the lines rarely reach all the way to the right, and thus the width is often 12 centimeters and the line length 85 to 90 characters. You may have come across the statement that 65 characters is an optimal line length and that you risk reading a line twice with longer lines. I don't really know where this is coming from, and either way it's incorrect. You will notice that if you test reading slightly longer lines. For example, if you read a cluster text, you will not miss a single line change. During the development of the cluster text, I noticed that the column width 15 centimeters is a bit too wide, and that the column therefore should be slightly narrower. Somewhere there is a breaking point, and I think it's close to 13 centimeters. The exact figure is hard to find out, but it should be somewhere around that figure. People have argued that we should not read columns wider than 14 centimeters because then we are forced to turn our heads. It sounds reasonable. I chose 13 centimeters as I am sure that we can read such a column width really well. Then we also get good margins for a page width of 19 centimeters. To get 95 characters with a column width of 13 centimeters, we need to determine more aspects. For example, we need to choose a typeface. Typefaces are drawn with different sizes and character spacing. We need to choose a typeface that will meet our conditions. Historically, typographers have often argued that we should use serif typefaces. People have expressed that they create a rail for the eyes to follow and that the serifs will lead the eyes further in the text. Recently, many have begun to doubt this. I belong, however, to the group that still believes we should primarily read serifs. I do this because I dislike all typeface changes. Such changes are uncomfortable. Constantly having to change typefaces feels a bit like a typeface terror. It's so annoying constantly having to adapt oneself to a different typeface. I prefer Garamond and preferably EB Garamond as it is free and open. The reasons why I prefer that typeface will soon become clear. We can start by comparing Garamond to some other typefaces such as Times New Roman, which is used as a standard by many. Look closely. When Times New Roman has the same X height as the Garamond, it looks a bit small and too tight. And when you adjust it so that it works just fine, you get only 91 characters and not 95 on a line. Times is thus narrow in its basic design, which is suitable for newspaper columns, something it was developed for in the 1930s. This possibly makes its legibility a little worse for longer lines. As you can see in the example, the Baskerville typeface takes up a bit more space at the same X height. Thus, its legibility is also a little worse as you can't read 95 characters on a line without making the typeface too small or too tight. The X height can be understood as the height of the lowercase letters, and it must be large enough. According to my investigation, it needs to be about 2.4 millimeters, which we get with EB Garamond size 10.5 points. Then we also get 95 characters at a column width of 13 centimeters with sufficient character sizes and sufficient character spacing. Also note that the Times New Roman is a bit darker. This was probably needed in 1930 newspapers. Nowadays we should not use typefaces that consume more printing fluid. It's one of the world's most expensive liquids and it can cost well over 5,000 euros per liter. Because of this, we should also avoid using some sans serifs as they are darker. For example, the common typeface Arial often consumes 25% more printing fluid than some other commonly used typefaces. Many sans serifs are designed for screens, and they are often a little thicker and a little narrower. This could mean that they should be avoided in print. If you examine a few different typefaces with serifs, it seems as if the Garamonts have the best size and the best character spacing, while at the same time you can fit the most amount of characters per centimeter. I mean that we should use typefaces with 7.3 characters per centimeter that are large enough and have sufficient character spacing, such as E.B. Garamond. A typographic rule is that narrow columns need slightly less character spacing. It can be seen in the upper left example. Conversely, longer lines need a larger character spacing. This is what seems to make Times New Roman and the many sans serifs a little worse for longer lines. It can be seen in the example in the middle. Note that the two sans serifs, Roboto and Arial, take up less space as they use smaller character spacing. They are tight. Also note their blackness. They seem to require more printing fluid. The Garamond typeface looks bright and should therefore consume less printing fluid. So should the last sans serif, Isabeau, as it also looks quite bright. For the 4 lines at the bottom, you can see that you can increase the character spacing for Roboto and Arial, and that you can decrease it for Isabeau. I have assumed that 7.3 characters per centimeter is optimal, and you get that if you use the terms for E.B. Garamond size 10.5 points, and then adapt the other typefaces to harmonize with it. Then you can increase the character spacing for Arial and Roboto and decrease it slightly for Isabeau. In the future, typefaces that are meant to be read in cluster text will probably be designed in this way already from the start. Hence, no adjustment will be needed in the future. Now we have produced the text and we understand a little why it might be reasonable. Thus we can start to determine all the conditions inside the text. We start by introducing a longer space between sentences, a sentence spacing. We do this because we do not want to jump back when we have started a new sentence, and we also want to get a signal far to the right in our reading span so that our perceptual center will be properly guided in the new sentence. I call these distances cluster spaces, and they should be 5 spaces large. They should not be smaller, and it is unnecessary to make them any larger. There are reasons why these conditions work, which you understand if you know much about reading. I will clarify that in a future presentation, but in this clip I will only describe the cluster text without explaining why it should look the way it should. We also have to make sure to get an appropriate line spacing. It should not be too big nor too small, obviously. With slightly longer lines, a slightly larger line spacing is needed. For E.B. Garamond, about 3 points is appropriate. Now we can start looking at the line changes. Historically, people have wanted straight margins. It has thus been a purely aesthetic condition that determined the right margin and thereby the line changes. This is probably also the reason why they wanted a line length as short as 65 characters. Straight margins probably demand a shorter line length to be comfortable. With up to 95 characters, we don't want straight margins. Neither are we satisfied only with the rag. For cluster text, we want as good line changes as possible, and then the look of the right margin doesn't matter. We do not determine the right margin by looking at it, but by actually reading the text. The perfect line breaks are thus determined by our reading. I have assumed that the line break should be determined based on the following hierarchy. We should therefore first take perception into account, then the constitution of meaning, then language, and finally we can adjust the line breaks aesthetically. It's troubling to describe all this by examples. You will understand this much better if you try to perfect a number of line breaks on your own. Therefore, I will only give a couple of short examples. You need not understand them properly right now, as you will understand all this immediately when you try to write a cluster text. These examples are only meant to guide you and make the problems visible. To begin with, we don't want single words on the far right, and we don't want cluster spaces on top of each other. These are the first line breaks we change. Now I must mention right away that it's not certain this is true. If arrays could manage, for example, stacks of cluster spaces, i.e. if they do not disturb our perception, it would have been better to leave them, so that we can work more with the constitutionistic and linguistic line changes. However, it seems as if the stacks are a bit disturbing. Single words to the right are definitely disturbing. Once we have corrected the perceptual line breaks, we can read the text. If we then notice that we experience questionable constitutions of meaning at certain line breaks, we can try to improve them. For example, it is possible that one should or should not break some lines between main clauses and subordinate clauses. It can sometimes feel as if a sentence ends if you break it in a particular place. Thus, it can be experienced as a small stop, a hitch, while we read. Sometimes, at the end of a line, you can also think that a sentence continues in a particular way on the line below, which it actually doesn't. You can sometimes influence that by sending down or up a small word, i.e. by changing a line break. We can also think about whether some linguistic words fit better or worse on the line above or below. Often it seems better to move down, for example, a, an, and the. It seems to apply if they come directly before a noun, i.e. if there is no adjective in between. This may not apply if an adjective is present. You can compare a car and a yellow car in the example at the top right. A in a car could be moved, but in a yellow car, a could possibly be left on the line above. You don't get good examples here. This is just an introduction, and as I said before, you will understand all this if you try to improve some line breaks on your own. You may also notice all this if you read many cluster texts. I'm not sure about these linguistic rules either. It's just a feeling I've got. It seems a bit disturbing to make a line break between words that are strongly connected. Perfecting such line breaks seems to help our reading. However, you cannot always perfect such line breaks. Sometimes you are forced to read a slightly worse linguistic line break as the perceptual line breaks are more important. Sometimes, for example, you may need to leave a the on the line above in order to remove a stack of cluster spaces. Sometimes it happens that the paragraph ends with a single word. Then you can see if you can shorten the previous line so that you get a longer closing line, and thus shorter lines in the paragraph. Hence, you don't have to strive to get as long lines as possible. In short paragraphs, it even seems that reading slightly shorter lines is preferable. Finally, when the line breaks have been perfected, you can see where it's possible to make the text look aesthetically pleasing. If you can smooth the right rag without impairing the reading, you can of course choose to do so. In the bottom right corner, you can see an example where the right margin is a little straighter, which is an example of an aesthetic adjustment. In the text, you also need to take into account a great many typographical details and rules. I will mention only one such example here. In the text, you can see a little vaguely that the numbers look too big. Uppercase numbers often look too big and they can be replaced with lowercase numbers. I will probably go over a bunch of such tools in a future presentation. Now I just want you to understand the critical aspects that make a clustered text better to read. You can read a text for which you have not corrected the typographic details about as well as for a text in which you have improved all of them. Now we have determined the text frame, i.e. the text itself. It must be placed on a page, and two pages collectively form a spread. Then we have to take into account the user characteristics of both the page and the spread, and we do that by adapting the margins. The outer margin is pretty self-explanatory. It should be 1 inch, about 2.5 centimeters, so that you can easily put your thumbs in it. Not everyone has the same thumb size, so possibly those with the biggest thumbs should be allowed to decide. I hope that readers with large thumbs can put their thumbs in a margin of 2.5 centimeters. The inner margin should be well sized so that you don't have to read curved text. This differs between different bindings. For books with thread binding that are easier to unfold, you can have a slightly smaller margin. And for extensive books with glue binding, the inner margin needs to be larger. I let the words option determine the inner margin. Hence, it needs to be 3.5 centimeters for thick books with glue binding. And then it can also be used for thin books with thread binding. Note that we now have a page width of 19 centimeters. We have a thumb margin of 2.5 centimeters, a column width of 13 centimeters, and a no reading of curved text inner margin of 3.5 centimeters. We also need to determine the column height. The conditions for good readers should decide it. If you can read at speeds over 500 words per minute, you can read a page in just over a minute if you use pages with about 700 words. This you get with 46 lines per page. That way, advanced readers avoid too frequent page turns. Troubled readers may also benefit from this. If you read slowly and have difficulty reading more than, for example, 8 minutes, you can read one spread at a time. With a column height of approximately 22 centimeters, we get 46 lines for E.B. German, size 10.5 points with a 2.9 line spacing. When determining the top and bottom margins, we can consider both usage and aesthetics. It may be appropriate to have a slightly larger top margin so that you can easily take notes in it. Then you can also find your notes when you browse all the pages. The top margin could be set to 3 centimeters. The bottom margin need not be unnecessarily large. It's enough that any folds of clothing do not cover the text when you put a book on your stomach. The bottom margin could be set to about 2 centimeters. In this way, the margins increase from the bottom outwards from 2 to 2.5 to 3 to 3.5 centimeters around the column. It is approximately 4/5 of an inch, 6/5 of an inch, and 7/5 of an inch around the column in inches. This might also look a bit better than many other options. Finally, we put the page numbers in the top corners. Then you can quickly browse them. Now we have arrived at the finished cluster text that is good both to read and use. At first, this layout looks a bit weird as you formerly have been accustomed to looking at rectangle text layouts, but in time, after having looked at such spreads many times, an aspect change will enter, and then the old spread will start looking weird. And above all, it will be experienced as quite annoying to read. It lacks certain important features that you may also begin to see in its appearance. The former text image may then start to signal that it is not as good to read, which could cause us to start seeing it as looking quite ugly. Now we have arrived at the cluster text, and I would probably say that you cannot design a better text. This is the true or correct text. This is what all text should look like. And this means that all other texts are wrongly written, and you will discover that when you read a cluster text. The cluster text is the result of us taking reading and usage into account. One must therefore go from being a text viewer, looking at text, to encountering text as a reader and user in order to develop such a text. This means that you try to remove everything that can hinder good readers and that you add all possible support. You should be able to more easily reach an immersive reading and to use a text in a better way, which I mean you can do with a cluster text. The reasons why we have ended up in this surreal situation is probably that so many people previously have looked at text and wanted to make them beautiful, and that no one has previously seen a text as a tool for reading and use for advanced readers. In this clip, I will describe how to produce a cluster text, and in the next clip I will describe its advantages. First, however, I will give a description of previous texts. I do this because then you can better understand what a cluster text is by understanding what it is not. A cluster text is not a rectangle text. Therefore, I will also describe how to produce rectangle text, i.e., how to construct the layout you are seeing right now. It should be obvious why I call such text rectangle text. Earlier, people wanted to create 3 nice rectangles, 2 columns and a spread. This applied even if you used a rag to the right, then you still made it close to a rectangle, i.e., you made a smooth rag. In the past, people have mainly been text viewers and they only considered the actual reading to a very limited extent, and when they did, they had a wrong idea about it, and, as it seems, they let the wrong readers decide some aspects. This will soon become clear. Previously, the spread was seen as a whole, and you wanted it to be perceived as harmonious when you looked at it. It was believed that the line length of 65 characters was optimal, and based on this assumption, you then wanted to design a beautiful spread. Therefore, the text columns were placed quite close to each other, i.e., with a narrow gutter. With too great a distance, the spread was considered to be shattered, as the pages were seen as if they were sliding apart. They also wanted the text to stand firmly on a large white block. With too small a bottom margin, the text was seen as if it was sinking. You could see this in the picture of the cluster text right now. The cluster text columns seem to be sliding apart, and they seem to be sinking. This will change when you have looked at this spread many times. In the rectangle text, the other margins were adjusted to the inner and bottom margins so that the spread looked good and harmonious. The spread was considered to look good as the margins decrease in size from the bottom margin outwards. It can be seen in the picture. Here, the bottom margin is 23 mm, the outer margin 20 mm, the top margin 18 mm, and the inner margin also 18 mm. However, as the inner margin is a little curved, it will look a bit smaller. Previously, the inner margin was smaller than 18 mm. Recently, however, it has been recommended to use a margin of at least 18 mm. The column width will now be approximately 9 cm for a page of approximately 13 cm. Then you have produced a handy book that is nice to hold in your hands. To get 65 characters for this size, font sizes of 9 to 12 points were chosen. Typefaces are drawn differently, so you choose the sizes that gives approximately 65 characters. The column height will be approximately 17 centimeters, and then you choose the line spacing that gives an exact number of lines on the page. Often you choose font sizes in full or half points and line spacing in full points. You can take a look in a number of different books to see different examples of this. Then you will see within which limits the conditions for the text column vary. Note that it was difficult to compare typefaces. You can always adjust so that you achieve the condition of approximately 65 characters. You can increase the column width or reduce the font size so that you get approximately 65 characters. Therefore, the choice of typeface did not play a very big role. For such a text, you do not reach an immersive reading, nor a particularly high reading speed. So it's difficult to determine whether typefaces are good or bad, and whether the change of typeface in itself is good or bad. With a narrower column, you can also choose a slightly tighter typeface without negative effects. Another example is that a rag to the right perhaps was somewhat better, but the difference was so small that it was considered better to use straight margins. A typographer's competence was that he could determine the variables with his typographic eye, i.e., he could make a text look good and make it legible by combining the right typeface with the right column width, line length, and line spacing. When the typographer had reached a typography that looked good, it was also thought of as it was legible. Note in particular that you never achieve a really good reading fluency, as you're constantly interrupted by the short lines and the bad line breaks, and that you neither will get any perceptual support, for example, between sentences. Therefore, you read such a text quite poorly, and the different choices do not have as great an effect. Readers did not seem to have found the many thumb movements and the reading of curved text to be particularly disruptive. You just pushed yourself through the text, and then the reading had to take the time it took. The biggest problem was to get the straight margins. Then hyphenation and tracking was used, for which the distances between the words varied. Those operations are not used for a cluster text. In cluster text, all word spaces must be equidistant, and the hyphenation is only used for particularly long words or in very specific cases. When you're finished, a rectangle text page contains about 300 words, as many wished for few lines on a page, often around 30. Some, often troubled readers, claimed that they found it difficult to read too many lines. Advanced readers read such a page in 45 seconds and were therefore forced to frequent page turns. By this, you understand that they simply adapted the text to the troubled readers. It should now be clear that not much consideration was given to reading or usage. Previously, everybody mainly tried to design a good-looking text. The trickiest thing about rectangle text is that they appear to be easy to read. Even I think it does appear like that, even though I have experienced that it is much worse. Now I have described how the different texts are designed. I guess you already have understood the advantages of the cluster text and the disadvantages of the rectangle text. In the next clip, I will clarify them.